Hello, everyone. I'm Sharif Abdel Kouddous with Dropsite News, dropsitenews.com. Welcome to our weekly live stream. Today, we're going to be joined by the prominent Palestinian scholar Rashid Khalidi, a leading historian of Palestine, imperialism, and the modern Middle East. And at the time of this broadcast, there are emerging reports from Gaza that an expanded military ground campaign accompanied by very heavy bombing and artillery shelling is underway in various parts of Gaza, including reports of Israeli tanks pushing into central Gaza, ground attacks in Khan Yunis, and deepening operations in Gaza City. This comes amid reports that Israel, it might be part of an even more expanded military incursion into Gaza to take over the entire enclave. Israeli media has reported that Israeli Prime Minister and international fugitive Benjamin Netanyahu favors a complete military takeover of Gaza, including in areas where the remaining Israeli captives are being held. He is set to convene his war cabinet today to discuss next steps. As it stands already, 88% of Gaza, according to the UN, is already in a so-called militarized zone or under Israeli displacement orders. And the genocidal assault continues unabated. The killing continues, the starvation campaign, the destruction. At least 87 Palestinians were killed over the past 24 hours, including 52 in aid massacres, what has now become a familiar term in the genocide lexicon, where starving Palestinians are gunned down every day while seeking food. That brings the confirmed death toll in Gaza over the last nearly 22 months to over 61,000, a number that's widely acknowledged to be a vast undercount. Also, over the past 24 hours, nearly 650 people were injured. We've seen a large rise in the number of injuries along in parallel with the aid massacres. And that brings the number of injured to over 150,000. Many of these injuries are life-altering. Also, 8 Palestinians died of famine and malnutrition over the past 24 hours, bringing the total number who have died as a result of hunger to 188, including 94 children, many of those in the past 2 weeks alone, as Israel's deliberate starvation campaign in Gaza has reached what food experts are calling an irreversible tipping point. So there's a lot to talk about today, and we're fortunate to be joined by the prominent Palestinian scholar and historian Rashid Khalidi. He is the Edward Said Professor Emeritus of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University, the author of many books. His latest is The 100 Years' War on Palestine. And Professor Khalidi just published a piece in The Guardian that is an open letter to the acting president of Columbia University, Claire Shipman, where he explains why he's withdrawing from teaching a fall course at Columbia. This comes after Columbia agreed to pay a $200 million settlement to the Trump administration after it accused the university of failing to protect Jewish students during campus protests against Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza. And as part of the deal, Columbia has agreed to appoint a vice provost to oversee the Middle Eastern Studies Department. It will order faculty and staff to submit to so-called trainings on anti-Semitism, and it will appoint something like 36 new security officers with arrest powers. I just want to read the last part of the article in The Guardian by Professor Khalidi. He says, quote, "Columbia's capitulation has turned a university that was once a site of free inquiry and learning into a shadow of its former self, an anti-university, a gated security zone with electronic entry controls, a place of fear and loathing, where faculty and students are told from on high what they can teach and say under penalty of severe sanctions. Disgracefully, all of this is being done to cover up one of the greatest crimes of this century, the ongoing genocide in Gaza, a crime in which Columbia's leadership is now fully complicit." Professor Khalidi joins us today from France. Welcome to the Dropsite News live stream. We have a lot to cover with what is happening on the ground in Gaza, the US and European role in all of this, their complicity in the genocide. But let's first start on the complicity of institutions in the US and specifically Colombia, where you taught for over 2 decades, for 23 years before retiring last year. Though you were still planning on teaching this large lecture course on modern Middle Eastern history in the fall as a professor emeritus. Why did you decide to withdraw?
Thanks for having me, Sharif. I mean, in light of what's happening in Gaza, what's happening on university campuses may seem secondary, but in fact, it's not. Because what has been happening on university campuses for almost 22 months represents an overwhelming majority of the American people's objection to American complicity in this genocide. And what universities have done has been to effectively try to shield the US government and Israel's government from any protests against this genocide, to, in other words, protect genocide. That's what Colombia and the Trump administration together are doing. The reason that I decided finally I could not teach the course was that Colombia just recently, a few weeks ago, decided to accept a number of conditions. They signaled that they would do so back in March when the Trump administration first made its demands. But looking carefully at the conditions that Colombia had accepted, it became clear that not only would they be doing the things that you mentioned, paying $200 million fine, paying over $20 million to people who claim to have been harassed or discriminated against, and not only instituting a special vice provost to oversee area studies and in particular Middle East studies. They would also accept, and have also now accepted, to have a federally appointed monitor, who in fact comes from an organization that recently had a celebration of Israel last month, who would monitor compliance with these conditions. And as I write in the article that I wrote in The Guardian, would have authority to go into classrooms, to go into meetings, to look at people's data, and so on and so forth. In addition to which, Colombia has accepted the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's guidelines, so-called, on anti-Semitism. Their description of anti-Semitism essentially is written specifically to protect Israel from certain criticisms and to prevent any criticisms of Zionism. To teach Middle East history, including the history of Palestine or Israel, to teach about genocide, to teach about the Holocaust, to teach about a whole range of subjects beyond what I would have covered in my course, but also including material I would have covered in my course, like the Armenian genocide, or the Palestinian Nakba, or what is happening today in Gaza. Under these conditions would have actually been impossible. It would have been very clear that I was violating this ridiculous set of rules that they've accepted. And I would be liable before the kangaroo courts that they've set up. You know, discipline at Columbia since 1968 was in the hands of the University Senate. And the University Senate included faculty representatives, elected faculty representatives, elected student representatives, and provided a system for discipline, which was generally accepted to function well from 1968 until recently. Clearly, it wasn't draconian enough. Clearly, it wasn't brutal enough. And over the last 21 plus months, the administration has taken discipline out of the hands of the, I would say, constitutionally mandated authorities for student and faculty discipline, and put it in the hands of faceless, nameless bureaucrats operating under rules that they make up, sometimes retroactively, to punish and discipline students who dare to criticize this genocide, dare to criticize American complicity. And at the same time, these as they go along, have been used to punish faculty members. So I finally decided that under these circumstances, I could not bring myself to teach.
Well, all of this appears to be the accumulation of a backlash against the student uprising that last year that began at Columbia, that grew to become one of the largest student uprisings across the country and the world since the 1960s, protesting genocide, calling on universities to divest and disclose from any ties to Israel. But, you know, the administration, were you surprised by the administration's reaction and its latest capitulation, or was it something that you expected?
Not at all. I wasn't surprised in the least. There is a fifth column within the university, members of the board of trustees, some of the donors, some senior members, especially of the professional schools, the business school, the medical school, the law school, and some alumni who for years and years and years have been propagating an entirely false narrative to the effect that Colombia is quote unquote anti-Semitic. What does this mean? People have had the temerity to criticize the state of Israel. What that has to do with the Jewish people is an issue that really is worth discussing. But as far as these people are concerned, it's an open and shut case. Anyone who criticizes Israel is prima facie anti-Semitic. Similarly, criticisms of this war or criticisms of Zionism or critiques of Israeli practices are by these people considered to be anti-Semitic. This is an old trope that they have been peddling for years and years and years. Members of the Board of Trustees have been saying this privately and pushing the administration to do something. They eagerly accepted the external pressure. In fact, I call them a fifth column, operating together with the Trump administration to fundamentally change the nature of Columbia University, change its governance, change its rules, change its disciplinary procedures, and bring the faculty and the students into line. I think that there's proof in student votes for divestment over several years, overwhelming student votes for divestment at Columbia College and at Barnard College, in the 2-to-1 vote of no confidence in former President Shafiq by the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, that very large majorities of the faculty and very large majorities of students felt strongly about these issues. The people who own the university, the people who run the university, the people who fund the university feel very differently. They feel there should not be such criticism of Israel. They feel there should not be any criticism or this kind of criticism of this ongoing genocide or of Colombia's complicity with it.
I mean, this struggle appears to be playing out across institutions in across various fields around the country, where you have the leadership or the management or the administration beholden to power, supporting U.S. and Israeli policy, while the membership or rank and file or students overwhelmingly are opposed and trying to speak out.
Right.
What does this, and this is all coalescing and centering on Palestine.
Right.
What does this say to you in this moment? Do you think it's time for people to quit these institutions in academia, in journalism, in cultural institutions? What do you think needs to happen, and what does it say to you historically that this issue of Palestine is what is causing this rupture?
Well, first of all, because it's clearly a moral issue. It's not the same for Americans that people in Sudan are being slaughtered, because the United States is not an actor in the Sudan. The United States doesn't arm the Sudanese army. The United States doesn't arm the rapid support forces. The United States does not arm the regime that is persecuting the Rohingya in Myanmar. The United States is not engaged in the persecution of Uyghurs in China. And the whataboutism that says, why are you complaining about poor little Israel when all of these other horrible things are happening? Those horrible things are happening, and we should be outraged by them. They are moral issues of great, the famine in the Sudan that's resulting from this horrific war is at least as bad in some parts of Sudan as what's happening in Gaza. People are starving to death. But it's not the United States that is providing the guns, the bombs, the Security Council vetoes, the political support for these massacres or for those genocides or for that starvation or for that persecution. So my response to the question of what should people do, they should be very, very angry. And they should do much more than they have done to force our elected representatives to represent us. And the views of the American people are now crystal clear. Overwhelming majorities of Americans are opposed to Israel's war on Gaza, on the Palestinian people. Overwhelming majorities of American people now oppose America providing the weapons for this massacre, this slaughter, this horrific level of attacks on systematic, constant attacks, not only on civilians, on infrastructure, on water treatment plants, on sewage treatment plants, on every single hospital and health facility in Gaza. Yesterday, they bombed the Red Crescent, the equivalent of the Red Cross. They bombed every single hospital in Gaza. Many of them are out of service. They've destroyed every single university in Gaza. This is not just an attack on the people. This is an attack on an entire society. This is not just the murder of innocent children. This is not just the murder of the largest number of journalists killed in conflict in the 21st century, or the largest number of healthcare workers killed in the 21st century. This is a systemic attack on the entirety of the Palestinian people in Gaza. And we are responsible, we, the United States of America, we American citizens. And those of our representatives who refuse to oppose this are opposing the moral, are taking a stand in favor of evil and against are opposing taking a moral stand, and are acting against the wishes of, as I've said, the polls are unequivocal in this 22nd month of this genocide. The people are opposed to this. They are opposed to the United States supporting it and arming it. And so I think that much more can be done, in particular to force our representatives to represent us on this issue. Why Palestine? As I've said, it is seen by especially people in the younger generation as the moral issue of their age, of our age. They are watching what the mainstream corporate complicit media refuses to show, which is online daily on their devices of various sorts, genocide. They're watching it. They're watching what young people in Gaza, who are targeted by Israeli drones, by the way, if they try and broadcast on these things. They're watching these things, and they are morally outraged. That's why you have the age skewing, whereby overwhelming majorities of young people are opposed, and lower numbers of older people are opposed to Israel's war and American support for it.
I mean, the assault on Gaza, the genocide, is approaching the 2-year mark, but there's really, despite massive global protests, there's little sign that it'll be stopped anytime soon. There's even talk, as I mentioned earlier, of a more expanded ground operation, take over the entire Gaza Strip, which keeps being phrased as to reoccupy the Gaza Strip, but Gaza has been occupied since 1967 by Israel. The starvation has reached this tipping point. We're now watching a live-streamed famine. But how would you characterize the response of not just the United States, but Europe, Western powers? We're seeing this, push by France, spearheaded by France and Saudi Arabia, to push for a two-state solution, as if this is some sort of bargaining chip, while people are, being killed every single day. What about the role of Europe and, as well, Arab powers in the region?
I think the response overall of the world, not just the United States, has been pitiful. It actually reaches the level of complicity on the part of Western European countries, which are arming Israel, which are politically supporting Israel, which refuse to cut their economic ties with Israel. Israel's biggest trade partner is the EU. All the EU has to do is turn the screws a little bit, and Israel will really suffer. They're so afraid of Trump, and they're so afraid of the Israel lobby domestically, whether in West Germany or Britain or France, that the politicians who know that public opinion is against what they are doing are unwilling to do what their peoples want, which is to take effective action, which they are capable of taking in economic terms, in terms of military aid, in terms of a variety of other things, to stop this. So the Western European countries, at least, and the white settler colonies, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, are as responsible as the United States, even though they have much smaller roles to play. Ultimately, the key actor in either enabling, supporting, arming, and funding this genocide is the United States. But these other countries have an enormously important role that they could play but will not. The two-state solution is a chimera. It's a red herring. The idea that you're going to remove 800,000 Israeli settlers from the occupied territories is absurd. This is a huge proportion of the Israeli population, which has been systematically planted in illegal colonies on stolen land over the past 57 years, since 1967. It's now 58 years, actually. And the unwillingness of Europeans and others who blather and mouth this meaningless two-state solution mantra is extraordinary. You want a two-state solution, end the occupation. You want a two-state solution, stop colonization. You want a two-state solution, remove settlers. You want a two-state solution, force Israel to obey international law. None of them is willing to do any of those things. They'd rather just jabber on meaninglessly about a two-state solution for which the prerequisites are simply not there in any respect, neither in terms of Israeli willingness or in terms of the situation among Palestinians. The Palestinian polity is deeply divided. It has no coherent leadership. It has no strategic vision. There's no unifying strategic vision. For whatever criticisms one may make of the PLO in its heyday, at least it unified the Palestinian people and had a clear strategic line. That's simply not the case today. So in every respect, the preconditions are simply not there for a two-state solution. Most importantly, getting the settlers out, ending occupation. I mean, you can't have a two-state solution with Israel in complete control of the entirety of the occupied territories, whether the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, or occupied Arab East Jerusalem.
I mean, it seems that the call for many years now has been one state with equal rights, and which following this genocide also, appears to be ever more distant, because how do we come back from this?
I think that the first and most important thing is stopping this war, forcing Israel to stop this war, isolating Israel so that it must stop this war, forcing the Israeli people to understand that they live in a settler colony that is entirely dependent on external support. Remove that external support, force them to come face to face with the fact that they are pariahs because of what their government has been doing. They're as a people, as a group, as individuals have become pariahs, whether they're in favor of this or not, because of what their government has done. In the past, even minimal pressure on Israel from the United States has forced Israeli governments to change policy. This requires more than minimal pressure, but that pressure must be exerted or this will not end. This will not end. And I think ending it right now, given the untold damage to young people and children from these days and months and weeks of starvation, in terms of their future development, in terms of their brains being affected by being starved of nutrients, the children who will grow up with all kinds of not just physical but also psychological problems. This must be stopped, and it can only be stopped by severely wrapping Israel across the knuckles, the Israeli government, and forcing the Israeli people to force their government to stop this. Growing numbers of Israelis are now opposing it. They are realizing that their nation has become a pariah, because in particular of the humanitarian crisis caused by Israel's purposeful, intentional starvation of the population of Gaza. But people are also realizing that their systematic day-by-day destruction, they are paying bulldozer drivers to destroy what little remains of the physical structure of Gaza, city by city, town by town, village by village, house by house, bulldozer by bulldozer. Those things are war crimes. And people are going to see this whenever finally Western journalists are allowed to get into Gaza. Of course, they're kept out of Gaza by Israel right now. But people are already seeing it live streamed. They already know from the courageous people amongst the Israeli media, increasingly Haaretz, but 972 Plus and a few other sites, which are showing us exactly what's going on from a perspective that only Israelis can get at, because Israel has complete control over the Gaza Strip. And in fact, according to the news that you just mentioned, they're about to take the little bit of it that they did not already control, the areas in Gaza City, in Beit Hanun, and in the coastal region called in Mawasi.
Well, I also want to maybe just step back. And so you're talking about this level of destruction. It is a paradigm shifting sort of level of destruction of Gaza. And perhaps if we can just take from a historical perspective, the Gaza Strip itself is a colonial construct. There was no such thing before 1948. There was the city of Gaza, there was Khan Yunis, there was Rafah, right. Historical cities, very important along important trading routes as well, religiously significant. But it was during 1948 and the beginning of the Nakba, where you had the largest concentration of Palestinian refugees in historic Palestine in this area that became the Gaza Strip, that was controlled by Egypt until 1967. And now it's always been a site of resistance, possibly the fiercest resistance in historic Palestine, and the site of the recipient of the most colonial violence from Israel. Can you explain why that dynamic exists and why it's reached this level now of genocide?
Well, I think you put your finger on it by saying that this is the largest concentration of refugees after 1948. The people who suffered the most during the Nakba of 1948 were people driven from their homes, whose lands were then stolen and whose homes were either demolished or used to house Jewish Israelis. And those people have always been those people who were made refugees by Israel in 1948 as part of its ethnic cleansing of Palestine to turn an overwhelmingly Arab country, 2/3 of its population being Arab in 1948, into an overwhelmingly Jewish state, the state of Israel. Those are the people who suffered the most. And it is from them that resistance has always been the fiercest after 1948. Before 1948, that wasn't the case. It was northern Palestine that was the site of the most intense resistance to the British. And the cities and the north, Galilee, the Jenin region, and Haifa, the area around Haifa. But since 1948 and the creation by Israel through ethnic cleansing of these refugee populations, as you mentioned, the largest concentration of them was in the Gaza Strip. And so resistance began in the Gaza Strip. The people who founded Fatah, many of them come from the Gaza Strip. The PFLP's deepest implantation, the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, was in the Gaza Strip. And Hamas was founded in the Gaza Strip. So what you said is true. It has been the most intense site of resistance because it is the area which encompasses the largest number of Palestinian refugees. It just follows directly. These are the people who suffered the most. These are the people who had the deepest motivation to resist. And what Israel has done is basically created through constant incursions into and attacks on the Gaza Strip, an increasingly militant population. Israel created this. This was a creation of Israel. It's impossible to understand Palestinian resistance or any anti-colonial resistance without understanding the violence of the colonist. The colonist's violence is what creates the violence of the occupied, of the indigenous population, of the colonized. And that's what's happened in Palestine. And these are the people who suffered the most from that colonial violence certainly since 1948.
You know, you said once in a talk soon after October 7th, 2023, that every settler colonial project has a metropole, and that part of the war in Algeria was won in Paris. And that the metropole for Israel is not Tel Aviv, it's New York and Washington. And that's where the war has to be won.
And Europe.
And Europe.
It has always been North America, Europe, and the white settler colonies. Those were the backbone of this project. Financially, in terms of where the Zionist movement was established, it was established in Basel. It got its funding mainly from Europe and the United States. And that's been true to the present day. Of course, the United States took over from the European powers after World War II, as it took over the global role of the old colonial powers. And that is, I agree, in fact, where an important element of the struggle has to take place. That's how South Africa was ultimately freed of apartheid. For all the problems that South Africa has, apartheid was defeated essentially because Western support for the apartheid regime was eroded by intense, vigorous activism in the United States and in Europe. The same thing happened, as you mentioned, in Algeria. It was constant proselytization of the French by the National Liberation Front and its French allies who opposed French colonialism in Algeria. Same thing was true in the Vietnam War. That wasn't a settler colonial project. That was just a colonial war. But American opposition to the Vietnam War, public opposition, and later on to the Iraq War, are what ended those wars. It took a very long time in all of those cases, years and years and years of suffering by the Vietnamese, by the Iraqis, by the South Africans, by the Algerians. But it was understanding strategically the importance of the metropole for these colonial wars. The same was true back in the early 20th century, when the Irish rose up against the British. They spent an enormous amount of energy in North America and in Britain proselytizing, arguing, raising funds, organizing. Eamon de Valera, who later became the president of the Irish Republic much later, but was the leader of the National Liberation Movement, spent the entirety of the Irish War of Independence in the United States raising money and gaining support from the American people and ultimately the American government for the liberation of Ireland. And that reflected a strategic understanding of the importance of the Metropole, which in the case of Ireland was essentially Britain, the United Kingdom, but also to a certain extent the United States. Because of the balance of power after World War I, Britain depended on the United States. And if he was able to win over people in the United States, in Boston and New York and Philadelphia and so on, he could win over the US government, and that could put pressure on the British. And that's what happened. So I think that's a key here. The pressure has to be put, which is why the blind support for Israel necessitates shutting down any opposition in the United States. They cannot have this. They haven't an argument. They haven't a leg to stand on anymore. How do you justify starving children? How do you justify the number of amputees in the Gaza Strip? How do you justify destroying every single university in the Gaza Strip? There's no justification. There's no argument. You could argue back in October, well, this is a response to a terrorist attack. That carried some weight at the time. It has carried no weight whatsoever for the last 20 or 18 or 16 months. And so in the absence of any possible argument, they basically have to repress. And that's what they are doing through the organs of government, through the institutions like the Board of Trustees of Columbia and Harvard and all these other universities that are kowtowing to Trump, whether it's Columbia, which is actually paid or is willing to pay the money that the Trump administration is asking, or whether it's Harvard, which has not yet come to terms with the administration, but already in anticipatory obedience, fired the two people who run its Middle East Center, shut down an agreement that they had with Birzeit University in the West Bank, and closed down a program on Palestine in their divinity school. So even before they were faced with demands from the Trump administration, they'd already done what they wanted, or some of what they wanted. It wasn't enough, and they will be asked to do more. And Columbia has been asked to do much, much more. But Harvard has already accepted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. In the case of Columbia, they said this will be the basis for disciplinary procedures. If you violate these ridiculous strictures vis-a-vis criticism of Israel and Zionism, you are an anti-Semite and you are discriminating against people and you're guilty of harassment, and you're going to be brought up before one of these ludicrous kangaroo courts that they've established, and some kind of punishment will follow. One of my colleagues was forced to leave the university. Others have been disciplined in other ways, faculty members. One of them, Marianne Hirsch, a distinguished scholar of the Holocaust and genocide, has said she can't teach her courses on these topics after having been brought before one of these kangaroo courts that they've set up, and has refused to teach. And in fact, her action was one of the inspirations for what I did.
I mean, hundreds of students had signed up for your class, and I'm sure they're disappointed, but you're not teaching at Columbia, but you still are teaching the course. Is that correct?
No, I'm going to teach a course which involves many topics from my Modern Middle East course, free online in a hybrid format at the People's Forum in New York City. And the details are yet to be determined, the dates, the times, how many lectures, and so on. I'm already developing a syllabus. It'll mainly focus on Palestine. I'll probably call it a short course on Palestine. My Middle East history course included a much broader array of topics. It went from the late 19th century right up to the present. I have a recording of last year's lectures in the Modern Middle East history course, which I will be releasing at some stage, and people can access that without having to pay Columbia's outrageous tuition fees. They won't get the full, experience. They won't get the discussion sections with these extremely talented graduate students who serve as teaching assistants. They won't be physically in the classroom, but at least they'll be able to hear the lectures and to look at the readings for the course. But that will be separate. That will be something that will be released as an online lecture series. I will be giving a live lecture series at the People's Forum in New York City which will also be hybrid and online sometime this fall.
And you were the first Edward Said professor at Columbia, named after the late, great Palestinian scholar and intellectual Edward Said, who himself taught at Columbia for many years. Who do you think the next Edward Said professor after you will be, or do you think there will be one?
I mean, there's a chair, which I had the honor to sit in for 20 odd years, that was established by a group of donors. It's up to the university to decide what happens as far as that's concerned. I don't want to say any more because I'm hoping that there will be a successor, a second Edward Said professor. But in the current atmosphere, it's impossible to say what will happen. I fear for Middle East studies in the United States generally. The willingness of governments to kowtow to these pressures, which are pressures that come both from the base of the Republican Party, evangelicals, people who believe Israel is right irrespective of what it does, but also very powerful Israel lobby, which has purchase with our politicians. Our politicians are in most cases not willing to do what their constituents want. They do what AIPAC tells them. They do what big donors tell them. And that's a particular problem with older members of the leadership of both parties, certainly the Democratic Party, the overwhelming majority of whose base is fervently pro-Palestinian, or at least supports Palestinian rights. Fervently pro-Palestinian is too much. It supports Palestinian rights and is critical of Israel. Has absolutely no voice in the leadership of the Democratic Party, and certainly none in the leadership of the Republican Party. But at least the Republican Party is true to its base, which includes a large number of evangelicals in the South and West who really strongly support Israel. Most Democrats don't strongly support Israel anymore. But the leadership, the Schumers and the Jeffries and the Clyburns and so on and so forth, the Bidens and the Pelosi's, all of those folks, those aged gerontocrats who run the Democratic Party are blindly support Israel and have always done so. So there's a huge gap, especially in the Democratic Party. It's growing in the Republican Party. Younger Republicans are much more critical, according to the polling that recently has been coming out, than are older Republicans. But the majority of Republicans are very supportive of Israel. Majority of Democrats are not. And the people who supposedly represent us don't represent them. They represent money, they represent power, they represent other interests. They represent their aged, feeble understanding of the Middle East derived in the 1960s and 70s when they were young people. And we're now in the 2020s. And maybe they should wake up and smell the coffee and understand that Israel is not some pristine beacon of democracy in the Middle East. It's an aggressor state that's attacked 9 or 10 Middle Eastern capitals in the past 30 or 40 years, that has oppressed the Palestinians since 1948. And it has done this with American support, such that the United States is guilty of all of these war crimes and all of these crimes against humanity that are being perpetrated today in Gaza.
Just a final question, or two questions. I'm trying to get a sense of your take on where things stand from kind of quite a broad historical view. I mean, this is the most violent episode in Palestine since the Nakba began. You have the genocide in Gaza. You have rampant attacks, apartheid policies, colonial expansion in the West Bank, in Jerusalem. Israel's bombing Lebanon on an almost daily basis. Hezbollah has been severely weakened. Syria's military capability has been decimated. Iran has been attacked and bombed. You have normalization with the Gulf states and Arab countries, with the exception of Yemen, not really doing anything. Are we in another 1967 moment where Israel significantly expands its territorial control, entrenches itself, enters into a new era of regional dominance as a colonial power? Or, as we've talked about, is the pariah status of Israel, has it grown to such a degree? Has the myth of Zionism been shattered? And is this the beginning of the end of the Zionist project? Obviously, I know this is a very big question, but where do you see this heading in this moment?
I mean, I'm going to begin with my usual my usual disclaimer, the job description of a historian doesn't include predicting the future. I have no idea where this is going to go. Obviously, I have some sense of where it is going right now. Both of the alternatives that you sketched out are actually true. Israel is the strongest that it's ever been in the region. It dominates the region from the Gulf to the Atlantic. It has client regimes in countries like Morocco and the United Arab Emirates, and submissive, subservient regimes in Cairo and Amman. It's bombed and attacked systematically Lebanon and Syria, and it's attacking Palestine constantly. It's attacking Yemen. It's attacked Iran. And it's done so with the full support of the United States, with American bombs. Every single Israeli warplane is American. Every single Israeli attack helicopter is American. Those weapons cannot be used offensively by U.S. law, and nobody seems to be bothered by their violation as senators and congresspeople of U.S. law in allowing Israel to do that. So, on the one hand, Israel is militarily bestrides the region like a giant. Iran has been reduced. Turkey is the only other power in the Middle East, really. The other countries are midgets compared to Israel. On the other hand, if you understand the historic connection between the Zionist project and later the State of Israel and its Western backers, the fact that overwhelming majorities of public opinion in the West oppose Israel for the first time in history since the beginning of the Zionist project, it has always enjoyed massive majority public support in every single Western country. This is no longer the case. It could change back, but as of this moment in time, in 2025, Israel is at the lowest, by far the lowest point in terms of support in the countries that constitute its metropole, the white settler colonies, Europe, and especially the United States. You've never had a situation like this in the entire history since way back when Theodore Herzl launched the idea of political Zionism back in 1897. Until today, you have never had, 128 years, you have never had a situation where there was overwhelming opposition. In some European countries, the support for Israel is in the 10s and 15% range. This has never happened before. And if this continues, there is a fundamental, irresolvable problem for Israel. It cannot operate without massive, continuous Western support. It does not have the capability to do that. Its economy is entirely dependent on the West. Its military is entirely dependent on the United States and partly dependent on Western Europe. And its economy is tied to Europe. It's the biggest trade partner of Europe. As those countries shift, if their peoples are able to force their craven, cowardly, corrupt politicians to do the right thing, which is a big ask, obviously. Politicians don't do what their peoples necessarily want. The American politicians continued the war in Iraq long after public opinion turned against the war in Iraq, and continued the war in Vietnam long after public opinion turned against the war in Vietnam. They can continue to do that for quite a while, but sooner or later, if this shift in public opinion continues, Israel is going to be forced to face a drastic future where it cannot continue to do what it's doing. I only hope that people will rise up and tell their governments, we do not support what you are allowing Israel to do. And that's not an easy thing to do. I understand that. You had people in New York City occupying the offices of Senators Schumer and Gillibrand, both of whom voted against halting weapons to Israel, even though 20 other Democratic senators, a majority of Democratic senators, for the first time, voted to stop American arms sales to Israel. There are many other things that have to be done. This is the most urgent moral issue as far as the United States is concerned. I'm not saying there are not more urgent moral issues. The United States is not funding and supporting and providing bombs to kill people in Sudan or to slaughter people in Rwanda or Congo or in Myanmar. Those are or what is being done by China to the Uyghurs, or what is being done by Russia in Ukraine. Those are situations completely out of American control. This is in American control. The United States controls this. The United States can decide, stop now, and it will stop. It will have to stop. They have no choice but to stop. You just stop the weapons flow. Stop the 155 millimeter artillery shells. Stop the 2,000-pound bombs. Stop the resupply of spare parts for the F-35s and the F-15s and the F-16s, and the war stops tomorrow. But our politicians are, as of this moment, not willing to do that, even though that's the will of the people, and has been for now quite a while, it seems.
And sorry, last question. You're the author
the last
of.
Question was the last question.
It was.
Go ahead.
There's just one more. Well, I just want to ask you about your next project. You know, you're the author of many books, seminal works, including Palestinian Identity, The Iron Cage, Brokers of Deceit, and the latest, which was a bestseller, The 100 Years' War in Palestine. But your next book is focusing, which you're writing right now, is focusing on Ireland and how it was a laboratory for Palestine. Can you just tell us a little bit more about why you decided to focus on British colonialism in Ireland?
Because I really think this is the origin of so much of what we're seeing today in Palestine. British colonial practices were widespread all over the British Empire. They did in Ireland what they did in Egypt or in Iraq or in India or in many other parts of the world. But they left Ireland after being defeated in the Irish War of Independence, and at the same moment that they were entering Palestine. And the veterans in the police and in the army were transferred in many cases. In the case of the Royal Irish Constabulary, it was transferred lock, stock, and barrel to Palestine to form the Palestine Gendarmerie. And the generals and the politicians and the policemen who learned their trade in Ireland most recently, then were the artisans of repression of the Palestinians in favor of the Zionist project for the first 2 decades of the British occupation and control of Palestine. They not only did in Palestine what they learned to do and practiced doing in Ireland, they passed those techniques onto the people who became the leaders of the Israeli army. During the Great Revolt of 1936-39, where the British brought in 100,000 men, 100,000 soldiers, they recruited over 20,000 Jewish so-called supernumerary police and Jewish settlement police. They armed them and they trained them. And they took these were all people who were in the various Zionist militias, the Palmach, the Haganah, and so on. And they took the best of them and they put them into what were called special night squads. And they trained them in British techniques of counterinsurgency. There's a British officer by the name of Ord Wingate, who's the most famous of the individuals who did this training and led them on night raids, taught them to blow up houses, taught them to shoot prisoners, taught them torture, taught them, there were others, obviously, other British officers. A man named Sir Charles Teagard was the one who trained people in torture, including members of the Haganah and the Palmach. So everything Israel has done, all the legal frameworks that Israel has used, the emergency orders that the British instituted in Palestine, based on the emergency orders that they had instituted in Ireland to try and suppress the Irish, were the basis for the emergency orders, some of which are still in effect. The 1945 emergency order is still in effect in Israel. The Israelis have never, what the British used against them in the brief couple of years when the Zionist movement opposed the British, is now being used against the Palestinians by Israel. British law, crafted basically on the basis of repression all over the empire, but especially in Ireland, is the basis of Israel's colonial repression, of legal repression. And the techniques that the British taught them, constant attack on insurgents, torture, mass incarceration, exile, all of these techniques, they're British techniques, taught to the people who later on became, people like Moshe Dayan was a student, people like Yigal Allon, these are generals, these are people who became chiefs of staff of the Israeli military. Yitzhak Sadeh, the first head of the Palmach, all of these guys were trained by the Brits. So this book will give you, it's a history of how counterinsurgency passed from Ireland, British counterinsurgency practices passed from Ireland through Palestine to what later became the Israeli army. One of the ironies is that one of the people who picked up these techniques later used them in Kenya and in Malaya and in Aden and in Cyprus after World War II in Britain's effort to hang on to its empire. He ended up the commander of the Parachute Brigade in Belfast and was the commander of the unit that carried out the Ballymurphy massacre and the Bloody Sunday massacre, a man named General Sir Frank Kitson. So starts in Ireland, ends in Ireland. That'll be the book, and whenever I have a chance to write the rest of it.
Well, we're very much looking forward to it. I want to thank you very much for joining us, Palestinian scholar, historian Rashid Khalidi, the Edward Said Professor Emeritus of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University, author of many books. His latest is The 100 Years' War in Palestine, and we're looking forward to his forthcoming book about counterinsurgency practices learned in Ireland. That does it for today's live stream. We're here Tuesdays at 9:30 a.m. Eastern. If you want to support our work, you can subscribe at dropsitenews.com. You can also make a 501c3 tax-deductible donation to our work by going to dropsitenews.com and clicking on Ways to Give. Make sure to follow us on social media platforms, let people know about our work. On behalf of everyone at Dropsite, thanks for joining us. I'm Sharif Abdel Kouddous.